Let's talk for a few minutes about positive leadership. By now, you've read the chapter in the book, and I'd like to provide some context for that chapter so that you might have a better understanding of why the chapter is in there and why the authors believe positive leadership uh, is a fairly new and important perspective on leadership. And I think it's particularly relevant to our class at the team level because team leadership and positive leadership go hand in hand. Let's start with a question. Let's say these are the characteristics of organization A. So if you were to describe the culture of this organization, these might be some of the words, phrases that you would use. Compare that to organization B. Again, if you were to describe the culture of this organization, you might use these words or phrases. So, an interesting question to ask is which organization would you want to work for? Organization A or organization B? Now, when I ask this question in the face to face class, historically, almost without fail, people say they would much rather work for organization B. Yet, when I ask them, for those who are employed full or part time, which organization comes closest to reflecting the one that they work for, they almost always say organization A. And this brings up an interesting question. Why are organizations the way they are? If we all agree that we would rather work for an organization more like organization B, we'll call it a positive organization, then why is it that most of us seem to be employed in an organization setting that is better characterized as organization A? Well, to answer that question, you have to look at the field of psychology, the influence that psychology has had on management and the practice of management in organizations, and the relatively new field of positive psychology. Psychology as a field began with three broad objectives: to prevent psychological or emotional problems, to repair psychological or emotional damage in humans, and to build human strengths. Certainly good objectives. Unfortunately, if you look at the history of psychology, you'll find that immediately after World War II, so this would be the mid to late 40s, and since then, up until the late 90s at least, the focus of research and clinical therapy in the field of psychology was on the treatment of psychological problems. One study a few years ago did a computer search of much of the major psychological literature and found approximately 375,000 articles on dysfunctional human qualities. So, some aspect of mental illness, mental disorder, psychological problems, things like that, compared to roughly 1,000 articles on positive human concepts and qualities. Now, that's a ratio of about 375 to 1. So clearly, psychology went to the dark side, if you will, in their focus on the first objective of psychology, which was has to do again with the treatment or repair of psychological damage. Now, that focus that psychology had on essentially repairing people, fixing people, heavily influenced our views of organizations, how they should be structured, and what they should be like. Organizations were considered to be like people to the extent that they needed to be fixed. To move ahead, you have to solve problems. And the solving problem mentality became very strong in organizations to the extent that we recognize for decades organizations operated under what's called a deficit-based management approach. And the idea in that is quite simply that there is an overarching focus on problem solving in organizations. And in fact, the reward system in most organizations evolves around this notion of problem solving, so that if you can identify problems and solve them, you're rewarded. Otherwise, you tend to be on the peripheral. Now, the consequences of decades of deficit-based management were a culture of weak, ineffective relationships between people and organizations. Remember, you want to be the one that solves the problem, and that doesn't necessarily promote cooperation and collaboration. It does promote a lot of defensiveness and finger pointing, which results in low morale. And an emphasis on problems does not result in a whole lot of creativity or innovation. Look at it this way. If you fix a pothole in a road, what you've got when you're done is simply the road the way it should have been to begin with. And that's similar to what happens in organizations. You simply fix problems, but it doesn't really move you ahead in terms of innovation. Now, in the mid to late 90s, we noticed a new movement in psychology that's become known as the positive psychology movement. It began with a psychologist who was president of American Psychological Association and introduced this idea in his annual speech to the conference at the time. Excuse me, on positive psychology. And he said basically that we've gone as far as we're going to go in terms of fixing people. We need to emphasize the third objective of the field of psychology, which up to this time had been forgotten, he argued. And if you'll remember, that third objective was to build people's strengths. So the question becomes not what is wrong with people and how do we fix it, rather what is right with people, how do we develop those strengths? Now, the focus of positive psychology are traits like optimism and hope and self-efficacy and spirituality, human virtues, and compassion, forgiveness, gratitude. There's many positive concepts and qualities associated with humans, and oddly enough, they have not been studied nearly to the extent as the problems, emotional and psychological problems or deficits that humans have. So positive psychology wanted to change the question and change the focus, the object of study. Let's take two examples and look at the positive psychology research. We'll focus on optimism and self-efficacy. Optimism is a generalized expectancy of positive outcomes. Everyone knows an optimistic person. They seem to simply expect something good will happen. Now, self-efficacy, you can think of that as self-confidence. It's the belief that you can produce a desired result by your own actions. If you look at the recent literature on optimism and self-efficacy, the results are quite clear and unequivocal. Um, those higher in optimism and higher in self-efficacy tend to show greater psychological adjustment and better mental health, improved physical health, more effective coping strategies, less stress, uh, greater motivation, perseverance, and goal effort. So clearly, the psychological literature has shown us that at least these two qualities in positive psychology are extremely important for personal development. The interesting question for us, though, is the extent to which positive psychology impacts things that we are concerned about in the workplace. In other words, should managers be concerned about developing a positive culture in their organizations? If you think back to organization B, the argument is, should we be concerned about actively promoting those kinds of characteristics in our workplace? Hope, optimism, gratitude, compassion, spirituality, are those important in the workplace? So there's been quite a bit of research lately looking at employee optimism and employee self-efficacy. And it's interesting to report that, yes, indeed, it seems that these types of human strengths and positive qualities are important in the workplace. They're related to employee motivation and performance. They're related to retention rates. For example, people high in optimism and self-efficacy are less likely to quit. They're related to goal-directed effort, resilience in the face of obstacles, ratings of positive leadership potential, less stress. So as a manager, you should be concerned about things such as employee optimism, employee self-efficacy, and some of the other human strengths. Now that brings us to the idea of positive leadership. And I'll just say a few words about that. I want to start off with a quote that I enjoyed from Ken Blanchard. Uh, the key to successful leadership today is influence, not authority. And a quote by the late management guru Peter Drucker. Leadership is the ability to align people's strengths so that their weaknesses become irrelevant. I think that's really a great quote and a great perspective that really reflects um, where the notion of positive leadership is coming from and how incredibly impactful it can be in the workplace. What both of these quotes suggest is that positive leadership is different than what we typically think of as leadership in organizations, hierarchical leadership, in that positive leadership does not rely on hierarchical authority or your place in the organization, power, intimidation, compliance, command and control. That's not what positive leadership is all about. Positive leadership is about individual authenticity, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, and being prepared to live those strengths and weaknesses every day. A seamless link between your values and your actions. Of course, positive leaders have a high level of self awareness, and perhaps above all, they believe in the positive potential of others and they help others develop their strengths. There are several good books on positive leadership if you want to read more about that, and I encourage you to. And I believe that positive leadership is particularly appropriate again at the team level because team leadership does not rely on a hierarchy, authority, compliance, coercion, persuasion. Team leadership relies on authenticity and positive influence. So, the conclusion to our original question about a relationship between positive psychology and management. Should managers be concerned about developing a positive culture in their organizations? Are positive psychology variables relevant in the work environment? And do positive psychology variables impact workplace behaviors and attitudes? From what we know about the research so far, the answer is absolutely yes. And I would argue that we're going to see more and more over the next decade of the importance of establishing a positive culture at any level in the organization. Now, keep in mind that we speak of organizational culture often as if it's a single monolithic entity that an organization has one culture. That's not true. We can look at an organization that way, and there may be aspects of the culture that do permeate all levels. But there are subcultures within organizations, and there can be a subculture within a department, a facility, even at the team level that runs contrary to the overall culture of the organization. This is important because as a team leader or a department manager, you can, hopefully, to the extent possible, promote and support a positive culture within your sphere of influence. And that can have many positive aspects. So hopefully this gives you some idea of why there's a chapter on positive leadership in our book, on something about positive psychology. There's quite a bit of literature out there. If you'd like more information or have any questions, again, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.